Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Sheri HASAN of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on January 19th, 2024 from karmicevolution.com or any of your favorite podcast stations. Before we get into this week's astro news you can use, my usual quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution, and that a new show drops every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern on most major podcast platforms. However, if you listen to this podcast at karmicevolution.com, you'll see a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which is friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about what each of us, depending on our individual sun sign, actually needs to be happy. So be sure to grab it when you listen to this podcast, whether you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some astrological words of wisdom from my former mentor, Stephen Forrest. In addition, if you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose, and what may be holding you back from achieving your highest destiny in this lifetime, I'm offering a 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125, a discounted rate for podcast listeners only. So, if you feel stuck, frustrated, or otherwise stymied in your relationships, your career, or other areas of concern in your life, and you want to learn why, then this reading is for you. If you'd like to understand how, by letting your unconscious script, which is based on old soul-conditioned behaviors from the past, run the show, and you now want to become more conscious about how to change this script going forward, then this reading is for you. And if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness through astrological insight, then this reading is definitely for you. Conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable when you take advantage of my special discounted offer, which you can find at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. All right, without further ado, let's get into this week's astro news you can use. So first, this week, I'd really like to focus on something that I touched on last week, which is the cycles that began when Saturn conjoined Pluto at 2245 degrees of Capricorn back on January 12th, 2020, followed by the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at 0 degrees 26 minutes of Aquarius on December 21st, 2020. So they happen almost a year apart, but within that same year. And then I want to move on to talk about the movement of both the Sun and Pluto into Aquarius, which is happening on January 20th, and the upcoming January 25th Leo new moon. I'm sorry, the Leo full moon. I always juxtapose those two when I'm writing, so forgive me. Let's tackle these cycles first, just to remind everyone, because I know that astrology is something that interests people mostly about what's going to happen in the future. But as I've said many times on this podcast, it's really about looking at the patterns, including patterns of behavior or collective events, things that have happened in our personal life which are related to those collective events because they're related to those cycles, but in terms of how those cycles manifest in our individual birth charts. So I want to revisit some of that and just remind everyone. Now, both of the cycles that I just mentioned, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction lasts about 36 years. It's a little bit of an erratic cycle because Pluto has an elliptic orbit rather than a round one. So sometimes it's a little bit shorter, sometimes a little bit longer, depending on what sign Pluto is transiting through at that time. And the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, which lasts approximately 20 years, and how these two set off new eras astrologically. And the Saturn-Pluto cycle has, at least in terms of modern history, represented periods of a new world order, or where a new world order has been defined. So let's discuss this first. And I mentioned last week that in 1947, it was post-World War II, and a new world alignment began with the Marshall Plan and the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, on April 4th, 1949, when the treaty was signed in Washington, D.C., and that was following the Saturn-Pluto conjunction at 13 degrees Leo, which occurred on August 11th, 1947. So you can see the North Atlantic, or NATO, was formed within a little, over 2 years, a little short of 2.5 years. No, I'm sorry, a little from August 11th, 1947, when the Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurred, to April. It's a little bit more than a year and a half. April 4th of 1949. And prior to that, the exact Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurred on October 5th, 1914, at 2 degrees Cancer. And that was repeated again on May 20th of 1950. So if we think about it, or we research it, and which I did, and look back, we can see that on July 28th, 1914, which was just a couple of months before October 5th, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, thus igniting World War I. So though my point is not to predict that the current Saturn-Pluto cycle in Capricorn will be followed by war like the last two were, it is interesting to note that the past two cycles leading up to this most recent one, which at least from a U.S.-centric point of view, drew America out of its traditionally isolationist stance to join these military conflicts, though in both wars that took some time. You remember we did not join World War I or World War II immediately, and in fact, when Hitler began his invasion of Europe in 1938, it took us until the Japanese became an ally with the Germans and attacked the United States in the form of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So that the Saturn-Pluto in Cancer cycles led out of, which took us through World War I, led to a new world order is undeniable. The aftermath of World War I saw far-reaching and wide-ranging cultural, economic, and social change across Eurasia, Africa, and even in areas outside those that were directly involved, according to Wikipedia. 4 empires collapsed due to the war, old countries were abolished, new ones were formed, boundaries were redrawn, international organizations were established, and many old and new ideologies took a firm hold in people's minds. World War I also had the effect of bringing political transformation to most of the principal parties involved in the conflict, transforming them into electoral democracies by bringing near universal suffrage for the first time in history, as in Germany during the 1919 German federal election, in Great Britain during the 1918 United Kingdom general election, and Turkey during the 1923 Turkish general election. And I think I said this, but this was according to what is written in Wikipedia. So back to NATO and the Saturn-Pluto in Libra conjunction in 1947. And again from Wikipedia, I quote, as a fundamental component of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty is a product of the United States' desire to avoid overextension at the end of World War II and consequently pursue multilateralism in Europe. It is part of the U.S.'s collective defense arrangement with Western European powers following a long and deliberative process. The treaty was created with an armed attack by the Soviet Union against Western Europe in mind, although the Mutual Self-Defense Clause was never invoked during the Cold War. NATO, which was a pact of alliance between the United States and 12 other nations, and those nations included Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United Kingdom and the United States. Oh, I said the U.S. already, sorry, redundant. Via which all parties, quote, determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of the peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, according to the treaty itself. So if one nation was attacked, all would respond. At the time, the Allies, the United States, Britain, France, and Russia, had emerged victorious against the Germans and Italian fascists. However, Stalin's command of Russia began the era of the Cold War, during which the Western alliance grew stronger after World War II, after that era, with the development of nuclear weapons by both the United States and the Russians. But NATO, at this point, has since grown to a current membership consisting of 31 countries, 4 of which joined during the Cold War, and which included Greece and Turkey, who joined in 1952, West Germany, who joined in 1955, and Spain in 1982. So since the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions in Libra of late 1982 and early 83, which was the next beginning of a new synodic cycle, we've seen an expansion of NATO due in large part to the continued realignment of the world order, throughout. Many of the Eastern European nations and former members of the USSR joined NATO after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And 2023 saw NATO welcome its 31st member as Finland joined the alliance in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Sweden's application is currently pending, but is still being held up by Turkey, which accused Sweden of harboring people it considers terrorists, including Kurdish separatists. However, Turkey's approval is expected in the next coming weeks after Swedish lawmakers passed new anti-terrorism laws last May, which it hoped would allay Turkey's concerns, prompting protests from some Turkish and Kurdish citizens in Sweden. However, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan finally submitted a bill approving Sweden's bid to Parliament in October of 2023. So the wait is long, but there is seemingly an end in sight. And again, here I quote, meanwhile, Ukraine's path to NATO accession remains uncertain, though NATO has stepped up its support for Ukraine in 2023, coordinating the delivery of member states' weapons and training. Sorry, let me backtrack for a minute, because what I neglected to say first is that since the conjunction of Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn in January of 2020, we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, which really admittedly began with Russia's annexation of the Crimean region in 2014. But it was that became one of the primary reasons for Ukraine's urgent request to join NATO. And it was Finland that followed, because of course once Russia invaded the Ukraine, Finland was worried about its borders and wanted to make sure that it was part of the NATO alliance, so that if it was attacked by Russia or Russia transgressed its boundaries, that it would likewise receive support from NATO allies, and again the same with Sweden. So more recently, of course, we're watching right now how the growing tensions in the Middle East, sparked by Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th, has already led to the current realignment of both allies and foes of Israel as it pummels Gaza in its attempt to eradicate the military wing of Hamas. And so under that banner, I meant to say that, talk about Ukraine's application to NATO, and that, what I was saying is, meanwhile, Ukraine's path to NATO accession remains uncertain, though NATO has stepped up its support for Ukraine in 2023, coordinating the delivery of member states' weapons and training. NATO does not have weapons of its own and is reliant on the contributions from its members. So, in other words, which most of us know, I'm sure, Ukraine's partnership or acceptance into NATO is on hold, and some of that had to do with financial requirements. You had to have a certain amount of GDP. The NATO has a certain amount of rules that any applying country must meet. But given the current circumstances, NATO members, obviously like the U.S. and Britain and France and others, have been supplying Ukraine, a non-NATO member, with weapons. And at its July annual summit in Vilnius, the NATO alliance reaffirmed its position that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Its members also voted to simplify Ukraine's path to accession, removing the requirement for Kyiv to submit a member action plan, which is designed to help candidates meet certain political, economic, and military criteria. I mean, if you're going to join NATO, and that means that if a NATO nation other than yours is attacked, you have to have the kind of strong military or strong enough military, right? That's going to make a difference if you participate or join in the fight. Okay, my apologies because I got waylaid by a telephone call that I had to take. So I'm not sure where I left off. Anyway, I will pick up where I think I left off. So forgive me if I'm being redundant. And I know I read this line, but I'll do it again anyway. At its July annual summit in Vilnius, the alliance, meaning NATO, reaffirmed its position that Ukraine will become a member. Members also voted to simplify its path to accession, removing the requirement for Kyiv to submit, I did read this, yes, a membership action plan, see, I'm not senile yet, which is designed to help candidates meet certain political, economic, and military criteria. Right, and I had mentioned that you have to have an army in order to be one of the members that can help defend another nation with your army should they be attacked, right? And the quote goes on to say, by removing that, essentially there is no other lock on Ukraine's membership to NATO, but fundamentally a political decision by NATO leaders, which is according to someone named Fabrice Potier, a former NATO head of policy planning and now the CEO of a political consultancy. NATO has also upgraded its relationship with Kyiv through the formation of the NATO-Ukraine Council. And Ukraine says NATO membership is the only way to guarantee its security in the face of Russian aggression. So all of what I just spoke about is by way of relating it to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction from January 12, 2020, and how it's progressed. So if it's an approximate, say, 35, 36-year cycle, we still haven't reached the first quarter square. However, I want to move on. So what I'm saying is, this is a waxing cycle and related it to the two previous cycles so we could see how they fell out in terms of history. And we know that we are on the threshold of, new things to come. All right. So in conjunction with that, as I mentioned, let's look at what Robert Wilkinson, a very well-respected astrologer who publishes a blog called The Aquarian Papers, called back in December of 2020 the grand mutation of December 2020 at 1 Aquarius, ushering in a new 200-year era. And the reason I'm going back to that is one that I mentioned last week, which is that we're going to see the Sun move into Aquarius, then Pluto move into Aquarius, all within a few hours of each other, and then the two of them will conjoin, excuse me, all on the same day of January 20th, which is tomorrow. So I want to read to you Robert Wilkinson's blog from back then, and then get to more recent stuff. He said, "We stand on a threshold of change at the December 2020 solstice when Jupiter conjuncts Saturn at 1 Aquarius. When these two heavily influential planets come together every 20 years, it resets many of the social and cultural parameters of the world, with new attitudes and new requirements replacing those which no longer fit our evolutionary need. For better and for worse, these mark major steps for society. They also indicate a major redirection of our personal energies toward the house in which the conjunction falls. Every 200 years, these conjunctions move from the predominant element of the past 200 years and move into a new 200-year period of the conjunctions happening in that new element." Now, some of you may be aware of this. Some of you may remember having heard about this or read about it. I know I mentioned it, I'm sure, 4 years ago on the show. However, or more like 3 years ago, because December 2020 was just a little over 3 years ago, right? But this is by way of refreshing our memories and then attempting to look forward. And Robert Wilkinson goes on, "There's usually a period where two elements overlap, which finishes one era and begins a new one. Air last dominated the 13th, 14th, and 15th, early 15th centuries. Water dominated from the early 15th through the end of the 16th century. Fire dominated the 17th and 18th centuries. And Earth has dominated every Jupiter-Saturn conjunction since then, except the last one of the fire era in 1821, all the way through to the last of the Earth era in the year 2000, which influenced the past 20 years. The first conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in an air sign, heralding this new 200-year air era in 2000, occurred in 1980. That year featured three conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in Libra in 1980 and 81 at 10, 9, and 5 degrees of Libra. So 3 years ago, he's saying, we entered a period of 200 years of unbroken conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in air, with the first one at 1 Aquarius promising a great building work which will serve as inspirational touchstones for the future. We are finally moving beyond the dense materialism of the past 200 years with the promise of more widespread focus on our commonality and ability to share ideas over the next 200. Okay, so yay, because I'm interjecting that the dense materialism of the past 200 years. I'm like, can we stop having to buy Ray-Bans and having to buy designer bags and purses and designer clothes? I hope so. Okay, back to Robert Wilkinson. Quote, "This period of air conjunctions will last until the last one at 29 Aquarius in the spring of 2199. The conjunction after that is in October 2219 at 15 Scorpio, which will usher in 200 years of water conjunctions. So our next 200 years begins with the Aquarius energy and will end with Aquarius energy. And that seems perfect for our approach to the threshold of the age of Aquarius." End quote. Now, I also went back and looked up, there is a book, I have no idea if it's still in print. I'm kind of guessing it's not. But there was a book put out, and I think this came out in the early 1980s. I think this was from 1983 or so. So it was right around the time of the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Oh, it says the copyright is 1984, and it's called the Jupiter-Saturn Conference Lectures with Liz Green and Stephen Arroyo. And in it, Liz Green talks about the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. And she, of course, is a Jungian psychological astrologer who sees the every 20-year cycle of Jupiter to Saturn less esoterically than Robert Wilkinson does, and a bit more archetypally. When Jupiter meets Saturn, it represents the battle between the old and the new. And she relates it to the myth of Jupiter and Saturn, whereby Saturn repeats the sins of his father Uranus by eating his children after it's prophesied that one of them will basically do him in. However, Saturn's wife Rhea, like Gaia before him, Uranus's wife, fooled him by giving him a stone wrapped in a baby's blanket to swallow instead of Zeus. Some of you may remember or know there's a famous picture of Saturn eating one of his children, which is pretty graphically gross. But, if we take it metaphorically, right, we also, see it on a different level. So when Saturn ingests the stone wrapped in a baby's blanket instead of Zeus, he ends up throwing up, and in doing so, he disgorges the other children that he swallowed in the past, which read the gods and other gods and goddesses, Zeus's brothers and sisters. And Zeus emerges from the cave where Rhea has hidden him and leads a rebellion, which banishes Saturn to the underworld, and Zeus becomes the king of the realm. Therefore, this repetitive Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycle tends to represent, and here I quote from the book I just read the title of, the image of something old dying, and an interim period of chaos and confusion, and the apparent supremacy of the old principle, which seems to have succeeded in repressing any new life that might attempt to emerge. End quote. Hence, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycle is known as one where, we might say as the British do, the king is dead, long live the king. On the collective level, I think it's pretty easy to peg the most recent Jupiter-Saturn conjunction from the end of 2020 to the changing of the guard in terms of Donald Trump's loss of the presidency here in the United States after that November 2020 election to the new one, Joe Biden. And yes, it's an irony that Biden is actually older rather than younger than Trump, but really not by much, as we know. And rather, we might interpret it as the death of the more repressive nature of Trump's presidential policies as they've been replaced by more liberal, less constrictive or protectionist policies under Biden. I do remember, too, as you guys know, I just gave a lecture for the Astrological Society of Princeton, for which I've been a member for many, many years and been on the board for the past, I think it's since 2019, that Bruce Schofield, who's a wonderful astrologer, usually gives an annual lecture. And I do remember him talking in 2020 before this election that he used that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius as a signature of a change and moving from that kind of the king is dead, long live the kid, old king to the new king. So I just wanted to mention that. And on a more personal level, Liz Green puts it this way, and here I again quote, "The old man is a representative of a negative patriarchy. He isn't a creative masculine principle, but a negative one who rules by belittling." Remind you of anyone? So an old ruling principle dies. But what is the new thing that emerges, she asks. The Zeus-type figure represents the one, again, quote, full of potentiality, she says. All he has is his hope and optimism, which can be accompanied by great fear. Because when the old king dies and the young king takes the throne, everyone is frightened. He might be weak and ineffectual. He might not live to fulfill his potential. Along with hope that things will finally become better and more creative, there is also the fear that the new potential will be cut off before it has a chance to turn out to be a disappointment. That is characteristic of the inner state of a person going through this transit, she adds. Now remember, the transit is currently waxing, as Saturn, or it's Jupiter, I'm sorry, begins to sextile Saturn currently, but the two won't square for a while yet. So it pays to remember that we're in a kind of opportunistic, I suppose we'll say. Sextiles usually represent the an opportunity, right? So we're more in that era of the overall cycle, a waxing sextile, than we will be in the future when the two square each other and there'll be more tension to deal with. Ditto for the other cycle, but that's even longer, as we noted, so it's going to take longer for that square of Saturn to Pluto to occur. Now, I want to go back to Robert Wilkinson because he's talking about what's going to occur tomorrow. And he says at 6:07 a.m. Pacific time, which would be 9 a.m. Eastern time on January 20th, the sun will begin to occupy the first degree of Aquarius, vitalizing and illuminating the grand mutation conjunction at that degree. The grand mutation he's talking about is the original Saturn, Jupiter-Saturn conjunction from December 21st, 2020. And he says this begins the enlightened building of an ideal. And at 4:50 p.m. Pacific time and 7:50 p.m. Eastern time that day, Pluto re-enters Aquarius and sets global transformation into motion. He continues, we've now completed the third year of a 20-year Aquarian era and a 200-year air era. This transit of the sun revitalizes the December 2020 solstice conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn and gives new power to the vision we've pursued this past year. Now remember what Liz Green said, after that conjunction is usually a rather chaotic period, right? The new king has to find his feet. There can be a lot of distrust. There can be a lot of uncertainty. I certainly think we've seen that, have we not? And in the middle of that, something I've mentioned numerous times, and when I do mention it, I do tend to go into quite a bit of detail about it, that in April of 2022, we had the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction for the first time in approximately 165 years in the sign of Pisces, and how leading up to that and since that and up until today, we have all this chaotic confusion about elections and the dissolution, which is the Neptunian part, of so many different Jupiterian subjects. So the dissolution of legal stuff in relationship to the separation between church and state, in relationship to all kinds of Jupiterian things, which again I've spoken about already and will probably do so again in the future when we're looking at situations we're currently involved in or mired in now in all these legal cases which are setting a precedent because the person both civilly and criminally on trial is a former United States president. So needless to say, that's a huge thing, right? So Robert Wilkinson continues that the initial Saturn pulse began its process of expansion, and that's what's in motion now. That energy is renewed every year by the Sun, Mercury, and Venus, and every 2 years by Mars. Each of these sets a new iteration of the building toward a collective ideal into motion. This year we have a quadruple trigger as the Sun, then Mercury, then Mars, and then Venus all transit 1 degree Aquarius. While we just experienced the final Sun conjunct Pluto and Capricorn, and that's for the final one for the next 248 years, right, based on the transit of Pluto through the zodiacal signs. In a few weeks, we'll see Mercury, Venus, and Mars conjoining Pluto at 1 Aquarius, beginning a new period of sprouting 1 degree Aquarius seed forms via Pluto. That means this year we have a particularly intense infusion of energy into making those themes manifest. These Aquarian cycles will transform our lives in countless ways, Wilkinson says, from our assumptions to how we work together to achieve common ideals. While many things won't be perfect initially, mainly due to our inexperience in this new energy field, coupled with the resistance to the evolutionary pulse from Uranus in Taurus, we'll get beyond this conflict as the global consciousness moves out of the selfish density of Earth attitudes, remember, designer clothes, materialism, and embraces emerging synthesized air understanding, end quote. Meanwhile, I think it's very interesting to note that it's been widely reported since the beginning of this year that a record, and in conjunction with everything that I've just discussed, the New World Order still coming into fruition in its nascent years, the beginning of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle manifesting in a concrete way, that it's been widely reported that a record number of nations will vote in new leaders this year, starting with the already declared pro-democracy winner of Taiwan. Thus far, as per the New York Times, on January 13th, and I quote, "In a setback for Beijing, Taiwan elects," and forgive me for mispronouncing, Lai Ching-te as president. Taiwan's vice president, whose party has emphasized the island's sovereignty, defeated an opposition party that favors reviving engagement with China. The Taiwanese politician Lai Ching-te has for years been reviled by China's Communist Party as a dangerous foe who, by its account, could drag the two sides into a war by pressing for full independence for his island democracy. Right up to Saturday, when millions, which was I think the 12th was a Friday, so this is the 13th we're talking about of January, just after the Capricorn new moon on January 11th, right up to Saturday when millions of Taiwanese voted for their next president, an official Beijing news outlet warned that Mr. Lai could take Taiwan on a path of no return. Yet despite China's months of menacing warnings of a, quote, war or peace choice for Taiwan's voters, Mr. Lai was elected president. Mr. Lai, currently Taiwan's vice president, secured 40% of the votes in the election, giving his Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, a third term in a row in the presidential office. No party has achieved more than 2 successive terms since Taiwan began holding direct democratic elections for its president in 1996. The vote drew a strong voter turnout of 72%, including many who had flown home from abroad. In some polling stations, lines began forming even before voting started in the morning, with many multi-generational families showing up in groups. There's Aquarius for you, huh? Taiwanese citizens who must vote in person fanned out to reach nearly 18,000 polling stations in temples, churches, community centers, and schools across the island. End quote. And this is from the Associated Press on January 10th. More than 50 countries that are home to half the planet's population are due to hold national elections in 2024, but the number of citizens exercising the right to vote is not unalloyed good news. The year looks set to test even the most robust democracies and to strengthen the hands of leaders with authoritarian leanings. From Russia, Taiwan, and the United Kingdom to India, El Salvador, and South Africa, the presidential and legislative contests have huge implications for human rights, economies, international relations, and prospects for peace in a volatile world. In some countries, the balloting will be neither free nor fair, and in many, curbs on opposition candidates, weary electorates, and the potential for manipulation and disinformation have made the fate of democracy a front and center campaign issue. And there's this from Foreign Affairs magazine, which says, 2024 is the year of a rare planetary alignment. Very interesting that they're actually, they're not talking about astrology, right? But they're using some of the same language, which you gotta love. Okay, the article goes on. The world's biggest democracy, which has parliamentary elections every 5 years, will go to the polls within months of the world's second biggest democracy, which has a presidential vote every 4 years. India and the United States join 3 other of the world's 6 biggest democracies, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, in what will be the year that the greatest number of people in history vote. Foreign Affairs article continues. This year, it's a little different from Associated Press, it says over 80 national elections are scheduled to take place, directly affecting an estimated 4.2 billion people, 52% of the globe's population, in the largest election cycle the world will see until 2048. Interesting, because at that point, Pluto will have moved into Pisces after 2024 when it leaves Aquarius. But I digress. Quoting again, in addition to the U.S. presidential election, voters will go to the polls in the European Union, India, Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and dozens of other countries. Collectively, the stakes are high. The candidates that win will have a chance to shape not only domestic policy, but also global issues including artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and internet governance. And of course, those things have a lot to do with free and fair elections, right? This year's elections, the article continues, are important for reasons that go beyond their scale. They will be subject to a perfect storm of heightened threats and weakened defenses, commercial decisions made by technology companies, the reach of global digital platforms, the complexity of the environments in which these platforms operate, the rise of generative AI or artificial intelligence tools, the growth of foreign influence operations, and the emergence of partisan domestic investigations in the United States have converged to supercharge threats to elections worldwide. Each election will, of course, be affected by local issues, the cultural context, and the main party's policies, but each will also be challenged by global threats to electoral integrity and, by extension, democracy. Governments, companies, and civil society groups must invest to mitigate the risks of democracy. Mitigate the risks to democracy and track the emergence of new and dangerous electoral threats. If they get to work now, then 2024 may be remembered as the year when democracy rallied. End quote. So let's remember that today we're just past the first quarter cardinal lunar square of the Aries moon to the Capricorn sun since the January 11th Capricorn new moon, which asked us, the first quarter lunar square was January 17th, which I meant to say, but the first quarter square comes after the, as I mentioned several times, January 11th Capricorn new moon, which asks us to plant seeds to provide them fortitude and maturity to apply a steady hand to negotiations within our partnerships. In other words, can we use this month's lunar cycle to responsibly negotiate between those who adhere to two different sides of an argument to a successful compromise? And the first quarter lunar square asked us to push through any tensions inherent in this kind of endeavor as we work our way toward the January 25th Leo moon. So, the January 17th first quarter lunar square really pitted the more emotionally fiery, I need to take action now, Aries moon in tension with the practical, responsible, grounded, cautious, but reality-based Capricorn sun. On an individual level, this kind of negotiation may be obvious between external individuals or groups where we've been trying to get them to come to an agreement. On another, more internal level, this month's lunation may represent our ability to bring two different sides of an equation about partnership to either stay committed but to get more freedom, or to abandon the partnership and to go our own independent ways. In other words, can we call upon the Saturn-ruled Capricorn archetype square to the Libra South Node and Aries North Node that occurred on January 11th to ground our thinking about partnership versus independence into practical, concrete reality. Well, it's interesting to note several happenings within the collective that are reflective of the fact that as we're now waxing toward the next Leo full moon, which again is on January 25th, but a ways away yet, we still have the third quarter. No, I'm sorry. It's the 19th and the 25th isn't that long away, but less than a week. But waxing means growing, and as in the tone and message of the original Capricorn new moon. And so that message doesn't change during the entire month. It only later gives way to the next new moon, which will be when the sun and the moon conjoin in Aquarius on February 9th. So we're still a long way from that, like I said, but let's live in the present, right? And let's be mindful that the present is reflective of what's occurred in the past, both long and short term. And to that end, we can see how two U.S. domestic issues have transpired. The first is from the headline that appeared in the early evening yesterday, on Thursday, January 18th, in the New York Times, that said, Congress clears stopgap spending bill for Biden, moving to avert shutdown. And the article says, hours after the Senate passed the measure, the House followed suit, with Democrats supplying the bulk of the votes a day before funding for some government agencies was slated to lapse. You may remember I mentioned this last week, which and talked about, surmising whether or not that Capricorn new moon was going to bring the steady hand to navigate the ship to the shore without allowing it to sink first. So the Times says Congress on Thursday sent legislation to avert a partial government shutdown to President Biden, racing to fund federal agencies through early March, one day before money was to run out. Over the strenuous opposition of far-right Republicans, the House voted 314 to 108 to approve the stopgap funding just hours after the Senate provided overwhelming bipartisan backing for the measure in a 77 to 18 vote, allowing lawmakers again to narrowly beat a Friday deadline. There will not be a shutdown on Friday, Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, and the majority leader said, because both sides have worked together. The government will stay open, services will not be disrupted, and we will avoid a needless disaster. And passage of the bill affords lawmakers another 6 weeks to negotiate and pass a dozen spending bills totaling $1.66 trillion to fund the government through the fall. The level Democrats and Republicans agreed upon earlier this month. That plan would hold most federal spending steady while bolstering the military. So in any case, President Biden is expected to sign this legislation before the midnight deadline today on Friday, January 19th. Now, there's hopes that this will be the last time they have to pass a continuing resolution. I mean, geesh, But the interesting thing is I spoke quite a bit last week, of course, about Mike Johnson, the current Speaker of the GOP, Speaker of the House, Majority Speaker, and whether or not this will end his reign as Speaker, because clearly with the numbers that I just read to you, there was overwhelming support by Democrats both in the Senate and in the House in order to pass this. And there's been a lot of talk about, holding out for that border agreement, and that, the mainstream Republicans are telling the right-wing Republicans that the compromise bipartisan package on the border issue that's been hammered out in Senate is their best chance of getting anything done this year. So if they don't want to lose that chance, they really should, get with the program. Now, I wanted to mention, too, that, I mean, I was hoping to mention more about some of these international disputes, but clearly, given what I said, all of the stuff I said about a new world order coming into fruition, we've got, the Israeli-Hamas situation and whether it will widen into a more far-reaching conflict. We have the fact that the Iranians sent missiles into Islamabad, Pakistan, killed 2 children there, and then yesterday, Thursday, Pakistan retaliated and killed several Iranians. Whether this is I think the Iran was after one of the militant factions in Pakistan, but Pakistan is a Sunni Muslim nation, and Iran is a Shia Muslim nation. So whether this boils down to a religious conflict or not, I do not really know, but it is, again, indicative of what's going on, because meanwhile, the United States had been trying to get the Saudis to make an agreement with the Israelis, which would open the door to easier communications, easier trade. So there's an economic angle to it between Israel and the other Arab nations, and Saudi would be the leader in that, which would have been, optimal. But they did not calculate on Hamas and its October 7th attack. So all of that stuff is in flux right now. And then the other thing that I already mentioned is the Taiwanese election and the fear of China invading Taiwan. I read something today that said they're not as worried about China taking military action in terms of bombing or something Taiwan, but setting up a naval blockade around the island, which I guess is also, you guys have heard me mention numerous times the Saturn and Pisces energy, which I still see as, blockages on the water, right? And that relates also to the Houthis, which are Yemenis, or they come from Yemen, attacking. They attacked a U.S. commercial vessel this week, and continuing to say they will attack foreign vessels in the Red Sea, until the Israelis stop their bombardment of Gaza, and of course allow in other things to that area, such as medicine and food, etc. So a lot is going on, but the point again is the realignment of a new world order, which, like I said, is pretty much happening as we're speaking, and keeping an eye on it, I think, is really important. Now, I want to say that the Leo full moon is again going to, the both luminaries will be opposing each other. The Leo moon will be opposing the Aquarius sun, which will be pulling away. It's about 5 degrees ahead of Pluto, right? From that January 20th to the 25th, it'll move about a degree a day, and yet is squaring, it's waxing towards a square to Jupiter, which will be at 6 degrees. So it'll be 5 degrees and 14 minutes of the Leo moon to the Aquarius sun at the same degree on January 25th at 12:54 p.m. Eastern Time, which of course is 9:54 p.m. Pacific Time, and they'll be waxing towards the square to Jupiter. So instead of the both luminaries forming that square to the nodal axis, which happened at the Capricorn new moon on January 11th, this will be more, the nodal axis, the luminaries in Capricorn, which is restrictive and boundaried and traditional and rigid, etc., which is why I said, we need someone who can steady the rudder or the hull or whatever, the wheel, whatever metaphor you want to use. But the Jupiter is a little bit of a, hubristic kind of energy. So will there be something we might need to release that, right? What's been successful and where do we not need to sit on our laurels and gloat or decide that, oh, everything's going to be better now because, we accomplished this avoidance of the government shutdown. Do we still have other problems? Yeah. So getting overly optimistic about certain things might not pay off. At that time, we also have Mars starting to wax into its square to the transiting karmic nodal axis. It'll be at 1552, while the nodes are at 1934 from Libra to Aries, south node to north node, and Mars and Mercury will have already come together the day before the full moon and Capricorn at approximately 1415, but at the lunation, Mars will be at 1552 and Mercury at 1439. So they're both waxing towards a square, right? And when they conjoin right before the full moon, there's always the possibility of some kind of announcement, right? Mars is war, Mercury is communication, Capricorn again is either not, it's the authority, so it could be the ruler. There may be some kind of, I don't know, again, could come out of Iran, some kind of hubristic, arrogant statements. I mean, we've been hearing them all along anyway, from Israel, from Iran, and from other places. In any case, there was something I read today too about Netanyahu. He just is pretty relentless and completely out of touch. So, we'll see. And then, of course, probably next week we'll go back to Donald Trump and his court cases and the Supreme Court and whether they've made, and Judge Engoron, which is supposed to, by the end of this month, make a decision about how much money in this, Trump will be fined in the civil trial in New York against the Trump organization, as well as the E. Jean Carroll case, which is just barreling right along, even though it started earlier this week, for defamation, where it's likely that there could be a huge amount of money in a judgment against Trump, like the one in the Giuliani trial for defamation that was brought by Shea Moss and Ruby Freeman in the Georgia election case. So stay tuned, because we got a lot more to talk about. I just didn't want to miss the opportunity to talk about some of these bigger cycles, so I hope that was okay with everyone. But you can't stop me now, can you? Anyway, it's time to say thank you to everyone for joining me today, and that I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me again next week on January 26th for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.